So please help me welcome our super session. Let's have a big hand for them, everybody. Once again, they're already on the stage, but we have Brian Carter and our super session Avengers right here, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, thank you. I didn't know I was an Avenger, but that's okay. I have to say, first of all, our technology struggles was we had all kinds of fun poll everywhere, so everyone was going to be involved in this. So we're going to have to go old school, and you all just shout stuff out and show of hands. We're gonna physical poll everywhere, okay? I'm counting on you as a group. I would like to introduce the panelists we've gotten together here today because we were really excited to have gotten Sarah to join us for the keynote, and we're especially happy to have her for another, I don't know what we have, probably 30 minutes or so to continue the discussion and to align a lot of what she was talking about to specifically what we do every day, which is school planning and design. So we're fortunate to have some really great folks joining us for the discussion today, starting with Scott Alterator. Scott is a passionate educator, researcher. He's the co-director at IDE, which is Innovation, Design, and Education, focused on bringing together the design and education narratives to achieve excellence in education. Scott's doctoral studies investigated innovative learning environments and their attempts to generate 21st century learning experiences. He's keen to share his learning about activating the educator's voice in the design of new school buildings. He's also Australian, so he uses words like keen. We also have Meg Parsons. Many of you know Meg Parsons. She's an architect and planner. She's an accredited learning environments planner from Minnesota. Many of you heard her yesterday, right? Speak also. Is really one of the preeminent planners in our organization and has been a part of our organization for many, many years. She also is on the Board of Architects in the state of Minnesota. Thank you. We also have Ed Peters. Ed Peters has been the Capital Projects Director at Edmonds School District since 1999. I have that right? And has been involved in numerous school design, planning, and construction processes during his career. He's been involved in several major bond campaigns and has been responsible for a significant amount of work in the Pacific Northwest. Many of you know him as sharing some of the success of that work throughout the state, the nation, and the world, really. Ed also was our Pacific Northwest Lifetime Achievement finalist in 2018, and again this year in 2019. Thank you for joining us today. This gives us a really great mix. We have an educator, an architect, and an owner, our owner representative, to join Sarah in the discussion. I wanted to show this slide briefly because several of you have heard about this discussion at Pacific Northwest Regional Conference or at the Washington State Conference when Ed and I were presenting some of Sarah's ideas. And I think we all recognize the kind of classroom environment that we see on, is that your right? And this organization has been having discussions about how to be more thoughtful about the learning environment than the traditional 20th century model that we see. But this image is great because it shows those echoes of behavioralism that we see in both in 19th and 20th century industrial design, industrial workplace, and then school design. And while we have these discussions a lot about space, this is a really great opportunity to start to talk about the whys behind why space matters. We share an idea that our students learn more gazing out a well-placed window and leaning reflectively against a deep daylit sill than they do in a direct instruction environment. The lens we apply to our schools needs to seek solutions that satisfy, but also look beyond concrete sequential commodities of program, cost, budget, and schedule. Our solutions serve students and staff, all of whom have an intuitive, sensory understanding of the world around them. The built environment, what we heard this morning, is that it profoundly influences our social, emotional, and physical health, and that's why this stuff matters. I have two really great quotes to kind of set the tone for our discussion. One is from Sarah's book. It costs just, I'm sorry, this is not from your book, this is from a lecture I saw on YouTube that you did. It costs just as much to build a bad building as it does to build a good building. I think that's important for us to understand. And Ed Peters said to me once that one of the worst uses of public funds is to design and build the wrong school on time and on budget. I think you have in front of your screen the instructions to the Poll Everywhere system that you will not be able to use. So instead of that, with the image of the small book here, I would like just by a show of hands to ask a quick question to set the tone, to know how deeply each of you is into this discussion. How many of you have read Sarah's book, Welcome to Your World? Probably about 10% or maybe a little bit less.
That's going to increase after today, Sarah, I'm sure.
Those books will be available. How many of you have heard a discussion about the major topics in her book at either the Pacific Northwest Conference in 2018 or the Washington Chapter Conference this year? So that was some good exposure. You'll hear some more now. How many of you have done both? Just look at you guys up front. Well, let's start the panel discussion with just a little bit of introductory comments from each of them. Before we do, I want to point out, I see we have two roving mics out there. One, we have Kelly Tanner, one of our co-chair people for the event today. And Philip Idle will have the other mic, and we do encourage this as active discussion, comment, especially when we don't have any ability for you to input, this direction. Please just raise your hand, grab the mic, ask a question, or make a comment on the topics we're discussing. This is meant to extend the discussion of the keynote ideals into school design, so have at it. Some introductory comments?
Is my mic on? Okay, so I just have a few things to kind of kickstart discussion, which one of them is, how does it change, or does it change, or could it change what you do if you think about the kinds of places that you're building, designing, and so on, as action settings? This, by the way, is a little church in Arkansas that was designed out of a 3-car garage. And the dome in the nave is an old, disused satellite dish. It's another one of these sort of negative budget buildings in which, you can do a lot with just some very, very little things. Okay, so in terms of action settings, I taught in architecture schools enough to know that, like, if you're thinking about a program, right, what you do is you make bubble diagrams with classrooms and laboratories and this and this and that, right? And I was thinking, what about if, or do people overlay that with what kinds of action settings, what kinds of affordances do you want to convey in each of these different spaces? Or, in more layperson's language, what kind of character are you hoping for in these spaces? So I don't know how you want to work this, Brian. I can go on to the next. Okay, yell. Anybody? Anybody want to take that up? Okay, I'll just keep going, and then you can break in when you want. Again, with enriched environments, one thing I didn't present was the idea that we know that people who are in more complex, better changeable environments, like take that school study, actually grow more neural connections, excuse me. I mean, you can see it. There was a study last year that was published that you could see they just develop better brains. Better spaces help you develop better brains. It's kind of unbelievable. And so if you think about that, you know, better brains are more flexible, they solve problems more quickly. How can you use texture, patterns, surfaces, materials? There's literature on each one of these different things. You know, wood reduces stress, for example, visible wood. How can we use these things? And then the final one. There's another slide? Okay. You know, it's an interesting question with schools because you don't want your students to be overstimulated, right? You want them to learn what they're supposed to be learning. So this may be an example. I mean, this is an, you know, like pre-K to kindergarten, so that's fine because you're not really trying to teach real material. But what levels of stimulation, of multisensory stimulation, are appropriate for what kinds of different tasks is a research question that I think would be really interesting to take on.
So architects who work with me always hear me say that social space is really important and very hard to get right. And that's one of the things I'm looking for help from them. To illustrate my learning curve, the corridor on the right is from the first middle school project I ever directed. This is Mount Baker Middle School in Mount Vernon by the Henry Klein Partnership. It's a wonderful school. I'm really proud of this design. It has many excellent features, including some really nice daylight that we achieved. They offset the corridors so that the first floor got daylight. If there were anything, however, that I would change, if I could go back and do this again, it would be in the area of social space, partially illustrated by the image on the left, which is from the middle school I did about 15 years later with Brian and his firm, Integrus. This is Meadowdale Middle School in Edmonds. These are the most successful flex areas that my district has ever done. Later on, we may be able to show you an image of the commons, which had a dramatic impact on student behavior. The 7th graders in the old building basically did lunch as a lockdown. You were assigned and you went to your assigned seat and you sat there with your tray and you didn't move because they were just too rowdy. Same kids in the new commons, completely different behavior pattern. And the principal said it became her favorite part of the day was to be out on lunch duty. So everything on this slide predates my reading Sarah's book. So yeah, we've learned things, but what I've been hungry for is having a rigorous intellectual framework to actually think about social space. And I got all kinds of things out of Sarah's book, but if you're only going to read one chapter, chapter 5, people embedded in social environments, I think that's the right chapter.
I don't even remember.
Yeah. Anyway, and that's where I first learned about affordances and action settings and action spaces and so forth. And just as an example, there's a paragraph where she has these 3 criteria which give me a framework to talk to you about social spaces and about evaluating them and thinking about them and trying to also justify them to school boards and taxpayers and so forth. And this is the book I've been wanting to read for decades, and I'm so glad you wrote it.
So for me, architecture has always been about people. And I think one of the reasons I enjoy doing schools, working on schools, is because it is about what happens in the school. It's about the students, it's about the teachers, et cetera. So much of Sarah's work resonates with me. One of the things that if I had to give my children and the children that attend the schools that we design would be that inspiration that comes out of being in a really cool space, that comes from a space that allows them student agency. Sarah talks about materiality and light and texture and pattern. One of the schools that I've worked on in my career, which I'm kind of proud of, is Alexandria Area High School, which you see illustrated here. This was a replacement school for a 1950s building. I know you know what those are. They're double-loaded corridors, they're concrete block walls, there's one teacher in each classroom. There's no social space, there's no informal learning space. What you see here is part of the academic learning area. You see a lot of transparency. You see both formal and informal learning, or social space, however you want to term that. You see that light permeates every inch of the building. I was at a session yesterday where they'd done a post-occupancy evaluation, and they talked about teachers putting up paper on the glass and how disconcerting that was, because that wasn't what was intended in the space. They've occupied this space now for 5 years, and there is not paper on the glass. And in part because the way this was designed, it was designed with the community, with the teachers, with the students. This is what they wanted. This is what they were craving. In the period of time when we started planning to when this building opened, they had been teaching in departments. We designed this building flexibly and adaptably so that they could continue to teach in departments if they wanted to, but in that time period, they did a lot of staff development. So when they moved into this building, it was really about, they were going to teach in academies. It was about each student pursuing their own passion. Don't know what's next on the... That's another image. Again, you see the daylight coming through. You see that there's both social and informal learning. You see the transparency between the academic spaces. Continue on. Oops, we missed one. The image that you took out that was supposed to not, but was, it was an exciting image. No, but one of the other places in this building is a 3-story eat, meet, greet area that the students really wanted because of that social interaction, and it also became the community living room because it was the pre-function space for both the auditorium and for the gyms. But I just, this idea of being able to have choice and to have an environment that allows you different ways to use it is really important. When I went back there recently, they now have kiosks so that when a student isn't in a formal learning setting, they can be anywhere in the building, and the way the administrators know where they are is because they've checked in on the kiosk. Again, it goes back to this idea of student agency, of being in control of your environment and what you're doing in it.
I think that's me, Brian. Would you mind bringing up that other slide? Is that possible? Okay.
Sorry.
No. Yeah, so Brian said I'm from Australia, and I'm actually from, live very near Melbourne, spend a good part of my working day in Melbourne. So the Melbourne miracle that you referred to earlier, Sarah, with the laneways and the alleyways, very much part of my day, and I think it's a wonderful thing, pretty exciting. I've been working with affordance theory for about 10 years through my PhD, and then as a consultant and as an academic, and the one kind of insight that I've had out of that, the one breakthrough for me, is just how powerful activity settings are, particularly as a translation device or a bridge between the discipline of education and design or architecture. So often what happens is, despite people having a pretty similar moral purpose and a goal of good education at the end, there's often people are talking at cross purposes, scenarios where people don't understand the particular language, the vocabulary used by educators and by architects. And so by distilling it down to particular pedagogies expressed as a set of activities, and we use diagrams like the one you can see to express that and to get teachers to choose from that. It creates a landing point that works as a shared language between the two disciplines. It's been really powerful for the work that I've done, and allows us to it is a distillation of an activity setting or a particular piece of pedagogy, so it has its limitations. It needs to be detailed by both the architects and by the teachers, but as a distilled, simplified point, it becomes really quite a useful device. So I'm really pleased to hear about your use of affordance theory and activity settings, or no, action settings. And I'm really keen to see how we can add dimensions to this as well. If we can add materiality, embedded cognition to this, then I think it becomes even richer and even more powerful for planning and evaluating and making better schools.
Thank you. I'd like to pose a question to the group here, thinking about some of these, just several of the many themes that we can pull out of the keynote, and thinking about social spaces, which we talked about, materials and textures, and light and pattern. The question is, how do we approach these themes in school design, thinking about a new paradigm of embodied cognition? And I'm curious if one of you would like to start with the discussion about that.
I can answer that just briefly with a kind of another question to say, in the end, what is the goal, particularly of social spaces? Meg has mentioned that we have different expressions for them, like formal spaces and informal spaces. But ultimately, particularly around social spaces, what is the point of them in schools? Like, what are we trying to achieve in doing that?
And my answer would be, is we want students to be responsible for their own learning. We want them to develop their own passions. And I'm thinking mostly right now at the high school level, because that's what I'm doing a lot, but even at the younger level. And those spaces allow different types of interactions, I think.
I'd like to show 4 slides briefly here, and thinking about this idea, and see if we can have some thoughts about what you might see on the slides. Which of these images you'd like to maybe hear more about it as a focus point? Again, thinking about embodied cognition and how these spaces are influencing or can influence students. I'll give you a kind of a precursor that all 4 of these spaces are basically circulation spaces in schools. A couple of them don't have kids in them, which is amazing what that does for the image. But nonetheless, here's the first one. It's up, right? Y'all can see something? Okay. Or 2. Now, if this were poll everywhere, I'd ask you to vote, but never mind. So,
Why don't we ask people to raise their hand? Hold up the end and
with the show of hands, which one of these images just they're all good images, I know, but you're not voting on which one's best, but which one really captures your imagination in a way that you'd like to discuss further? 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay,
fast.
ready? We'll go backwards. 4, 3, 2, 1. The winner's 4. My favorite is 3, and I had one person with me. Thank you. Many of us know this school, actually, in Virginia, right? What do the panelists see in this image?
Well, one of the things that I think is interesting about the image is the change of levels, because, you know, kids grow and they change, and they change levels. And I also think that changing levels is a way of articulating spaces while within a larger open space, if a larger open space is what's called for. And of course, I actually looked at that image and I thought prospect and refuge. Like, you know, here you have these like little refuge spaces, but then you can stand over there and you can see everything that's going on. So there's a kind of reassuring quality to it, and lots of different opportunities and activities that you can do. You can sit over there, you can go to the lockers, you can walk down the hall, you can sit on the steps and so on. So,
What was the terminology used for the blue canopy things that you could then you could go and be in your space and then look at other people?
prospect and refuge.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's sort of what I see with the benches on the upper side,
Yeah,
is that you've
right.
got a place to kind of be and to observe as well.
The theory is from, like, which is actually, this has been invalidated, but it doesn't matter because it's still true, that humans evolved on the savanna. And so what you want is like refuge places with trees around them where you can hide a little bit and sit, and then also prospect and see if anybody dangerous is coming to eat you up. We now know that humans evolved, yes, on the savanna and lots of different kinds of environments as well, but the theory is pretty basic. It still holds, so.
Some of the research coming out of the UK at the moment, the expression is that the best spaces have a mixed economy of available spaces, which the metaphor is maybe a bit misplaced, but I quite like the idea that there's these kind of variation of spaces, that there's opportunities for students to engage in a range of ways, and then for teachers to be prompted in a range of ways to have students learn. And I at least can kind of get a sense of that with this image, with the smaller spaces along the right-hand side. I don't know the school, so I'm sort of making an assumption there.
Yeah.
This strikes me as the kind of design where you would want professional development and what we've talked about is educational facilities commissioning, of showing people how to learn how to use the space. We have a space like this at Cedar Valley Elementary in my district, designed by Milam Architects, that is wonderful, but when we first opened it, the complaint I heard was, well, how can kids study on the right side when we're taking a class out to the playground down the corridor? That's a solvable operational issue, but if you just throw people into this environment without giving them any professional development, it's going to take them a while to figure out how to use it, even though it has wonderful features.
Does anyone have any other observations about it? There were a lot of hands on this one.
Right?
Here,
We'll just wait for a
What?
mic.
Mike,
Kelly?
here.
Down
Right
front.
up front.
Sorry, you're called out. Hang on.
Okay, one of the commonalities I saw in some of the pictures, on if the panel would speak to this a little bit, is just about the space, the movability within the space, and even the keynote there was words about, having the room to move, and so that relationship between the body, the physical body, and movement of your arms and legs, and how you can go, and how that relates to, sort of the higher order of what we're trying to do in the learning environment, which is, learning these sort of thinking skills. So just talking about wider corridors, more room, not overcrowding.
I think a couple of things that I see in this image, going back to your, going back to some of the items that you have highlighted in your book as well, Sarah, are the elements of scale, textures, variety of, colors, patterns. It really embodies pretty much everything you talked about just a few minutes ago.
Mm-hmm.
Brian,
well, one of the things that I'm noticing is all of the wayfinding on the side and all the graphics that are along the transition space. So what's really interesting about that is that you're creating additional layers within the spaces as you're transitioning through the environment. So you're creating a corridor, you have flex spaces, you have prospect and refuge, but you also have some interest as in layers of the graphics. So it's super interesting as you go through that to, as people are going out to the playground, you can kind of explore maybe the forest or whatever that says on the side. As you go into the outdoor environment, you are looking for some of those things that are on the wall.
All right, thank you. You got one more?
I think it's a beautiful image, and it's got great expansion of a space. That it's very expensive, so that's why I like the other slide with the transom overhead and the solid doors and the color of the wall going into the doors. I think that speaks more to where our district is and what we might be able to do with spaces in terms of security and openness. We all love the doors with the glazing, the full height glazing, but then we're also tasked with how do you close that down, and how do you prevent teachers from putting all kinds of screens or papers or things on the doors that make it look chaotic. So that's why I love this image.
I'd be curious, actually, Sarah, to hear some of your take on this image in particular also.
Well, you do what you can, right, with what you have. And the advantages of this image are, there are a number of advantages. Well, I don't know if that's a skylight or artificial light, but it may be a skylight. It's a skylight, right? So you have daylight coming in, at least in the circulation spaces. I should say, a friend of mine did a really interesting study of a very famous school in Copenhagen, in which the architects designed a kind of staircase like this. I mean, it was round, but a sort of open, spreading staircase coming down. And they said that was going to be the social space in the school. And she's an environmental psychologist, and so she actually did a post-occupancy evaluation and watched how students used that staircase, and none of them socialized there. Which they felt it was too exposed and too busy, and there weren't, in other words, there wasn't enough of a hierarchy of different spaces. So it wasn't really a genuinely social space. I think that these have some good moves. Daylight, a circulation space that isn't just a basic circulation space, wood on the floor. Wood, I think, is really important. Natural materials in general, not just for what the associations that it brings, which is, to give you some kind of connection to nature and some kind of complexity and texture visually, but also acoustically. Wood is really important because it just develops better acoustic qualities. And by varying the colors, one of the things that the coloration of the walls does is break down the scale in what is otherwise just a basic corridor. So those are good things.
So to respond about this, what I have learned from Sarah's book is when I think about affordances, that you will have more opportunity to use this space for something besides student movement between classes. If you did, in fact, don't put the glazing in the door, because that's very hard to screen off. But if you put some glazing in the window, in the wall, then the teacher can supervise what's going on. And if you have to do a lockdown, there are some pretty simple shading devices that you can pull down very, very quickly. And then the space is actually more usable and affords more opportunities for what was your phrase?
Informal learning.
Informal learning, yeah.
Thank you.
Brian,
Yes.
I have a comment.
Well, what took my attention on the fourth picture is the contrast between the warm and the cold. And to me, the cold is just move fast and continue, and the warmer area is
the other one, no.
breaking down,
That's
sit down, learn. That's what took my attention the most.
Thank you. Let's look at a different
Right.
topic.
I'm
Oh,
sorry.
you guys love these.
If we could go back
Hot
to
dog.
school 4, just,
That
I
one,
think
Phil?
if we could go back to the slide of school 4.
That's 4. You want that one?
No, next one. I think what strikes me about the space,
That one?
the other direction, is this one here, is the varying volumes that are created and the ceiling above ceilings. And if you took those classroom walls and brought them up to the ceiling, you wouldn't have anywhere near the same kind of space or perception of that space. But the idea that those volumes are changing as you move along really contribute significantly to that experience.
Brian, one of the
Thank you.
things that's interesting is that we're really talking about the raw built form, and that's really one set of affordances only. As soon as you throw a whole bunch of students in there, and you have to work with the routines of a school, and you have to work with the customs of the particular teaching culture that has emerged in that place, and all of the structures like timetable, attitudes, resources, space allocation, then you set up a whole new layer of affordances as well that need to be negotiated daily as you move through the space, as you decide which room you might be using. And there's there's an emerging field or at least a take on affordances called cultural affordances. Have you come across cultural affordances? Yeah, which is a really interesting attempt to combine the human experience as well as the kind of sustained human patterns that emerge in a space, and then to read the affordances once that's going on becomes pretty complex, and you've got to combine it with material affordances. But there's a whole new dimension once it's a lived building. I mean, a building, to achieve good education, a building is necessary but not sufficient. You must also have an alignment with the education program and the intention of the building, which is why I always come back to that question of what are we really trying to achieve? How do we make a link between the kind of ed that we imagine, the philosophy, the vision, the pedagogies that need to be implemented to bring that about, and then what sort of spaces do we need to do that? And it's a pretty complex picture, but it's worth thinking about, and this is the framework to do it in, I think.
Can we go back to the previous one for just one last comment? So I predict that if you walked into that school during the school day, at some point there would be some chairs and desks pulled out into that space. I've yet to walk through a school anywhere. I've been going to these conferences for 30 years, and every time we walk through an occupied school with double-loaded corridors and no breakout space, there's chairs and stuff because they need some breakout space. And people are doing it, so let's provide for it. And like you say, think through what they're using that for and make the space accommodate it. Because they're gonna do it.
One more.
Thanks. If we go back to the image of discovery. This is actually, I just wanted to comment because my wife was actually a teacher in the school when it first opened. So a little bit of context for some of the comments that I was hearing. What's interesting is it's a beautiful image, right, and a lot of fantastic rich materials. The aspect of it that was most well received by the faculty was the transparency. And so they actually didn't cover the windows with paper. The fact that they could collaborate more easily and could see what was going on was actually perceived as a benefit by the teachers. On the other hand, one of the things, again, this is sort of anecdotal, but one of the things that was perceived as less successful was the the amount of environmental graphics and the fact that it sort of limited the ability for personalization, that it was much more specific to a design program and not so much to the everyday use of the school. So just in terms of the perspective, it's one thing to look at an image, it's another thing to live it every day. This was an extremely successful school.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on to another topic to discuss. We're going to do our manual poll everywhere. I'd like to think a little bit more about daylight in our space and light and pattern in particular. And the question I'd like to pose to my panel is, does this space work and why?
This particular space?
This particular space.
I'd like to see the other side.
It is an old photograph in green.
No, is it a Hertzberger school?
It is.
Yeah. I'm not going to opine on that. But what I am going to say is that daylight is one of these things that everybody loves and everybody says it's great. But, you know, it's really hard to do late daylight well, because one of the reasons I said I wanted to see the other side is if you have a wall of windows on one side and then opacity in the rest of the room, you're going to get a hell of a lot of glare, which is is bad for people and for students, and it gives them headaches and so on. So it's such a complicated thing about which light engineers know a lot, but you know, light engineers aren't designing most of these spaces. Architects are. I mean, the advantage of this is that you have the ceiling and then the light. So I'm neutral.
Yeah, I would like to know more. I'd actually like to walk through the building, because I can't tell what the quality of light is here. The photograph looks like there's a lot of glare. And the kids actually sitting at the window, I wonder what quality of light they're getting.
So I think there are places where you really need to control light, and there are other places in the building where it can just illuminate. You know, if you think of those informal learning spaces, or you think of a larger space. The thing that appeals to me about this is these kids have views. A lot of our schools, little kids cannot see out the windows. And if we talk about the focal length of our eyes and being able to shift from here to there, that's really critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to come at this from an educator's angle and reflect on my own practice. I spent 12 years teaching philosophy to senior students in a high school before moving into research. And it's just made me, I quite like the fact that there are no curtains on that, or blinds on those set of windows, because so often I would enter a room, and I was in a high school, so we'd often get kind of shipped around as teachers to different rooms. You would move into a room and all of the curtains would be in just complete lockdown. There'd be no sunlight at all. People weren't, and then what I realized was that people weren't actually even thinking about that they had these kind of mechanisms at their control to either increase or reduce the light. And this was in a building that was kind of 3 stories up, looking out of a canopy of the beautiful park in the middle of town. And it was an early insight for me to realize that people weren't thinking very much about their environment. So in many ways, I like the fact that, as well as liking lots of Hertzberger schools, I think that the fact that there are no no curtains on the windows is good.
We can also control glare from the exterior of the building with sunscreens and fins.
And planting.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I've got the microphone, so I'm going to go ahead and start speaking.
Where are you?
Over here.
Where? Put your hand.
Hi.
Behind the podium.
So as far as this image and daylight, I think it's fine as long as the kids can move out of the glaring daylight. And what I noticed about the other image was the natural analog that was there. The blue wall looked sort of like the sky, and the cream-colored path looked sort of like a beach. And to your question earlier, why do social spaces matter? I just want to mention Maslow's hierarchy, that to reach the top of self-actualization, you have to take care of the base first. So do I feel safe in this space? Do I know where my next meal is going to come from? Am I going to get a restful night's sleep? Have I eaten? And then the social belonging aspect is the next rung on that pyramid. Do I feel like I belong here? Is there family here? And then you go on up the pyramid. So I think the importance of social space is simply that. Belonging and family is part of Maslow's hierarchy. And if we're going to learn at the top of the hierarchy, all those other levels have to be dealt with.
So what I appreciate about this image is the collaborative learning. You imagine the students paired here, they're discussing amongst themselves, maybe they're working together, the prospect of looking out. We don't know what they're looking out onto, so yes, more information would be important, but they presumably have a choice. Do they have to sit here, or could they sit in a different setting? So I also like the stools. Presumably they're engaging their core. They're not just sitting back, slouching, and accepting learning. They're actively engaged.
Anyone else?
I don't like the stools, and I was actually going to make a comment on that. And I was curious because, Sarah, you mentioned the research with the clipboards. If I recall correctly, they also studied furniture in that study as well, that softer chairs also led to pro-social judgments compared to harder chairs.
That's
so when we
correct.
look at this furniture here, does that contribute to these students' learning, or would you say that that maybe detracts a little bit? Or, depending on the context, what does that do here?
Well, it depends on what kind of learning you want. The stools is sort of like sit down for a sec, but you always have the option of it's sort of like a porch, right? You can say hi to your neighbor, but you can always escape into the house if you really don't want to talk to them. So stools are kind of like that. It's like I can sit there for a little while, but then I can always get up and get off. It depends on what you want.
Just so you know, your panel rejected the idea of stools up here today.
Nick said I'm not sitting on a stool.
I said I'm not sitting on a stool.
On that image, the question was if we think that it works, but I don't think, like, as you can see the shadow on the left, so they're receiving sunlight directly to the students. The fact that they're isolated, I mean, I like this, the fact that they have this little nook, but then they cannot collaborate with the ones on the other side. And the stool is the other part. I don't think they look very comfortable to be sitting for a long period of time, and their legs don't even touch the floor. So that's my observation.
Just why I rejected the stool.
Thank you, Philip. So I'm just looking at the image, and it's really hard to know what's going on in the classroom. I think we're all putting our own experience into what's happening in this classroom. And as a designer and going through art school and desiring that opportunity to sit in front of a window and sketch people as they're walking past a plaza, I'm hoping that they're sitting in this window and maybe they're working on some type of artwork, and what they are doing is a individual project where they might not need that collaboration, but they're focusing on what that fine motor skill might be to sketch something that's on that exterior. And without that beautiful window providing that view, they wouldn't have that opportunity. So I think it's really hard to answer the question, is this successful or not? It depends on what experience you're trying to get out of that space.
Thank you. One more, and then I think we have time for one more theme to take a look at.
That's why I love the stools. I think stools at a counter are a different animal than stools on a stage with nothing in front of you. And
Thank you.
if you were on stools, I'd be able to see you better.
Uh-oh.
But I get yours.
But my feet wouldn't touch the ground.
Right, but, right, when you were a kid, and you loved swinging your feet on a higher seat. So, and I think this image to me feels very soft and contemplative and kind, with the kids parallel working and imagining something out there that they're looking at is a beautiful element. So I love the stools.
If only we could ask the children what they were doing.
Right. Well, I think we should have a WWF-style stool face-off after lunch. I appreciate that for me, that last image, just the complexity of that space and the fact that so many of us craved more knowledge about what the space might be like than we could get out of that one image is, in and of itself, really interesting. It's an interesting space. This was it was going to be a poll everywhere. What's really interesting about this is a simple question. why does this space work as a learning space? And I'm going to give a little hint that I think it's a really interesting question for this image, because I think we all see a lot of effectiveness there, but there's very little in that image that's immediately about space.
I know this school well, and I know when that photo was taken. It's from an Australian school and an Australian designer who is in the audience. And it's not a posed photo. It was just a photo shoot that we did on the day the classes were going on. It was just opportunistic photo, not posed, which I know a lot of the architecture photos are necessarily for various reasons. This one isn't.
Does it work?
Does the photo work to communicate what's going on?
Does the space look does the space work as a learning setting?
Well, I can tell you just briefly what's happening is that this photo is actually taken from inside. So the column you can see on the left, the timber upright, is a part of the door frame. And so it's taken from inside. And if the cameraman was standing just to the right, you could also see other groups of students kind of hunkered down over crayons and textures and pencils and paper, doing the same activity but using different technology in order to achieve that. And so the teacher is quite an active teacher. Her name's Jana, and she moves from inside to outside really quite quickly, and almost she's kind of constantly moving between these spaces.
I'd just like to say, can we finally accept with this image that we have debunked the idea that you can't have daylight in a space where you're using technology?
Yeah, I mean, how often did you not use your phone in the sun at the bus stop? I mean, come on, does that not happen?
Philip's comment, for those of you in back, is that obviously technology and daylight work together. I think that's for gym teachers, right? Comment. All right. Before we close, this is also our opportunity for question and answer and comments specifically for the keynote ideas that Sarah presented. I've got the mic, so I get the first one, which I thought was, when we were talking about pattern complexity, it struck me that what a lot of us deal with now is the increasing rate of autism and the need to service those students. And what we hear a lot, not just to service those students, but the general population, is theory on space being too busy and being counterproductive, which I've always struggled with because I've liked the idea of pattern complexity and the order that can be achieved out of that. And I was thinking also at the time of Stravinsky talked about the role of dissonance being to help us understand the consonants. Obviously he was talking about music, but I think that's really appropriate in spatial patterns also. And I'm curious, when you were talking about pattern complexity and you think about many of our teachers want more simplicity and less complexity in the patterning in their spaces, but then they put up a lot of stuff.
Then they put up a lot of stuff.
What do you think of that?
Well, that's something that I think has to be done on a commission by commission basis, because what a lot of people ask for is very simple spaces, but then they put up all this stuff in patterns that are not very calming. Student drawing here, student drawing here, student drawing here. People don't like that kind of thing. We're hungry for, I can't remember the word that this one author that I was reading said. It's like we're voraciously seeking patterns all the time. I mean, it's like we're pattern seekers. We need to understand, because that's the way that we say, okay, I got that environment, now I can focus on this. And So if you can work with the people who are your clients to say, you know, there's a certain level of rhythm, and pattern can be a lot of different things. It can be projections and recessions, it can be material, it can be wallpaper. There's so many different ways of doing it, some of them more aggressive and some of them more subtle. And then, of course, you have the degree of complexity, which is actually is calculable as a ratio. But the reason people like pattern complexity, I should have said during the talk and neglected to, is because it basically duplicates what we see when we look at natural environments. You know, like those slides that I showed you about beautiful environments, there's a degree of species diversity and complexity within very predictable patterns, and that makes people feel calm and happier. Now, autistic children, I plead ignorance. You know, that's a very complicated thing, and I know they get overstimulated very, very easily, so I just don't know.
Any other thoughts to share?
Well, except that in terms of the material relationship with, in schools at least, and catering for students with special educational needs, the literature is really, really slim. And it's a field needing a lot of attention. In my research work, we're looking exactly at that, because there's not an evaluation, there's not a set of evaluations that create a feedback loop to designers or even to educators for usage of space that is it particularly in the service of making sure that students with extra educational needs have the best experience they can. And it's a serious gap.
Mm-hmm. I'll just say that that's one thing, that there's a very severe need for post-occupancy evaluations, which are very difficult because architects don't want to pay for them, and clients are like, oh my God, I just spent all this money. Now you want me to spend more money on a post-occupancy evaluation, and I don't even want to know if it doesn't work well. So, you know. But someone somewhere has to figure out this problem. I haven't figured it out yet, of how we get the data that we need, because it's really critical.
You know, just as a parent, I think most of our elementary classrooms are overstimulating for everybody. I think that all children benefit from those kids that may have those special needs. If you think about a typical elementary classroom and you think about all the stuff that's around the room, from the alphabet with the red apple and the big black outline, I mean, you wouldn't have that in your house. Why would you subject your kids to it for 6 hours a day?
I think just on the post-occupancy evaluation, there's also got to be a recognition that it's more than the material in a school. It's more than environmental quality. It's more than the raw materiality. It's got to be about occupation. So that requires really sophisticated post-occupancy tools.
Right,
yeah.
And we have the tools to do that, but we don't have there isn't the institutional structure for that to happen. There's a question over there.
I have a theory about the teacher clutter. About the teacher clutter issue, and I would love to get your feedback on that. My sense is that it's a way of creating safety for an isolated teacher who's alone in a classroom with 25 or 30 kids and having to manage all of that, and that they paper their environments, and maybe the teachers in the room can say if this rings true, in order to feel secure, that their back is covered. And so when you take away all of that, you strip away all of that, and they become transparent, if they're alone trying to deal with these 25 or 30 kids, they're completely focused on the kids. Who's got their back? Who's watching for that, shooter that's coming out? So that's my theory why you see so much clutter, that it's actually a self-soothing. What do you think?
Can I?
I can give a.
Can I add an
I think it's got to be
additional item to that?
contextually responsive. We did some research in Australia at the University of Melbourne where we looked exactly at the differences between these new environments that were open and lots of transparency, and actually the teachers reported and the students reported that it gave them a greater sense of community, much more connection to their peers, their colleagues, and that made them feel more secure. But that's a particular context. That's an Australian context.
Well, you know, I look at other educational pedagogies like Waldorf schools where it is about the natural environment and it's about the relationship between that teacher and those kids. In the Waldorf pedagogy, every morning the teacher shakes the hands of the students coming into the room and looks them in the eyes. And she or he knows what that child is coming into the room with. And if you think about a child that goes to the beach and plays in the sand, they don't need, you know, all the stuff. They're just playing in the surf. And so I really do think that clutter, at least in my life, I don't need clutter. I don't want clutter.
There are a couple of questions.
Just to add to that, I have been maybe 6,000 to 7,000 learning environments around the world, and I have a particular collection of photographs of 1,000 items on a wall, almost always in a primary school, with this non-ironic description above it saying focus wall. And there's some research that came out in a collection from a collection of different organizations this spring about the importance of having very little on the walls, particularly in primary schools, that the intensity of reading, writing, making, talking needs relief, not just looking out a window and seeing nature, but looking up and seeing very little, and what's there is purposeful. Ideally, a huge piece of that purpose would be learning process. So we would see here was an early iteration, here's the feedback we received, here's the next iteration, here's the feedback we received. And spaces that allow us to make that changeover quickly rather than kind of accumulating these 1,000 items on the wall are, I think are important for us to be sharing with our schools all around the world.
Thanks, Nick.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lenny Scott Weber, and I want to speak about post-occupancy evaluation because I've been doing it forever. I think it's incredibly important, and I think that you do have to have really robust tools in order to be able to do that. I think you have to understand what your question is. And for us, in the work that I've done for many years, it's about that engagement and how the built environment impacts engagement, whether or not it does or it doesn't. So for the architectural community, sometimes that's really scary because research doesn't always answer yes, it does. Research sometimes says no, in fact, it's really not working. But I think the process now really has to think about all of the pre-design and then moving all the way through to, is it working? And until we are honest enough to warrant that, I think it can come, it's a very small amount of dollars and cents to do this. And to do it right, to go through scientific research protocol, the human subjects review boards, all of that kind of thing, it can happen, and it can happen and be built into the part of the project, and it's not a lot of money. I really encourage all of you to get on that bandwagon. It's incredibly important for educators and for those who are risk averse, which is the educational community, because they may only get to build a building one time in their lifetime, and building an innovative space is scary. And so if we have that data behind that saying innovation actually can work and support the goals for education, I think is critical. Thanks.
I think it's time to probably wrap up the discussion here so we can get to the closing comments. But I want to emphasize, well, first, thanks everyone for participating so well in kind of a manual poll everywhere. It's always a letdown when suddenly, okay, we got to change the nature of the game. We do, when we started this discussion after Sarah published her book a couple of years ago, we said that we wanted to start and continue a conversation. And we do have a site. It's actually on the Washington Chapter Members Connect site. We'll be starting a Members Connect area, blog area, to continue. Sorry, I don't keep up with times. At the Members Forum for you all to participate. And we also will be posting a kind of a starting of a research list or a book list, so where you can go and find some more information on the topic. So I appreciate all of your participation today, and want to ask the panelists if you have any final comments before we close.
Will we go in opposite order?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to give you a quote from Sarah's book, and if you haven't read it, I really recommend you do. It's one of those rare things which is a page-turning non-fiction book. So, I love them, and I read a lot of non-fiction, and many of them are not page-turners, but this one really is. And I think you said this in your speech, not simply the built environment, particularly this is really true for a school, not simply a backdrop or a stage setting. The quote, worlds we build construct the literal, actual scaffolding we use to cognitively construct ourselves as people, other people as human beings, and our relations with one another. So if there wasn't ever a kind of a call to how important it is to get a school building right, that clearly is it. And I really enjoyed listening to you and reading the book, so thanks very much.
Thank you.
I would echo that. Again, I felt great resonance with what you have done research on that I feel intuitively is important for, our kids. And, as we go forth and do the designs in our communities, yes, cost and budget are issues, but I think you said, it doesn't take more to make a beautiful building than it does to make a building that doesn't do the things that we want. Something that's beneficial for kids. We want kids to be taken to the next level, and this is something we need to consider.
I just want to reinforce what Brian said, that we are interested in continuing this conversation. We're going to try to create some tools for doing that through Members Forum. We'd really love to hear and get you to contribute examples. We'd also encourage you to help us recruit researchers and make more of a connection with the academic world. There's all kinds of great research going on. It's just not very accessible to school boards and superintendents and people who are actually making the decisions. And if we can get that information in front of them, I think it will make a difference. And I just want to close with, again, I sincerely mean, I've been looking for this book for decades, and I'm so delighted that you wrote it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to say it's been a privilege, really. You're a wonderful organization, and when I got the invitation, I was so excited because I care about schools. So thank you all, and you've been wonderful.
Thank you for participating.